We got a battle brewing across Washington and Wall Street when it comes to immigration, particularly on immigration's impact on Silicon Valley and jobs.
America faces a growing demand for skilled workers, particularly in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM field. From 2023 to 2033, the U.S. will need about 1 million more STEM workers.
Wow, that is quite a few. 1 million more STEM workers between 2023 and 2033? That is so many.
Million more STEM workers, and the number of tech workers is expected to grow at twice the rate as the overall U.S. workforce. To offset,
that's good to hear. I think certain sectors of technology have seen ups and downs during COVID and post-COVID. Some scenarios, they were pulled back and then are starting to resurge now. And some are in the opposite situation where they surged around COVID and then are starting to fall back down. But I do agree and believe in this sentiment, which is there's so much technology behind everything that we interact with. Like if you think about your phone, for instance, there's so many people who think about materials, about the design of it, about the processor, about the interactivity, the touchscreen, the buttons. There's so many things that exist in that, and there's probably engineers and maybe a handful or even dozens of them for each one of those pieces. And then they assemble it all together. Then there's the manufacturing engineers and folks who are making sure things can be shipped, the software or other technology for helping place those orders, manage their employees. It goes on and on and on. And I think this is something where while technology is getting smaller and easier to use, it is something that is actually taking larger and larger investments to make. I think AI is a good example here where we have these AI models that people starting to use, like ChatGPT, that took billions of dollars to invest in, and people interact with it, and it's fun, and you get to ask it a bunch of questions, and it talks, and you can find some interesting scenarios where maybe it messes up or whatever it is. But there was so much investment into getting to that point. But then you have a system that's so easy to use and interact with, and that it's being used for a variety of companies and use cases. And so I think this is still going to be the trend, which is that technology is sort of going to be that segment of the iceberg that's sort of below the water that you can't really see. We're going to be interacting with a very small portion of all the investment that's required in order to interact with technology, whether that's physical or digital products, infrastructure, whatever it is.
Set that skills gap. The H-1B program, created in 1990, allows U.S. businesses to temporarily hire foreign workers in certain specialized fields. Visas, initially granted for 3 years, are capped at 65,000 annually, plus an additional 20,000 for foreign professionals who graduate with a master's degree or higher from a U.S. college. Some employers, like universities, nonprofits, and research institutions, are exempt from the cap. In 2024, about 400,000 H-1B visa applications were approved. 65% of those were people renewing their visas. Tech companies dominate the program. The top companies with employees holding H-1B visas include Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft.
Employers have an incentive to bring in lower paid, lower experienced workers at the expense of U.S. workers who compete with them, but also there's little that can be done. So the H-1B program right now, you could say, is functioning to bring in cheaper labor.
Companies seeking to recruit lower cost workers is one of the key issues detractors point to.
The tech industry.
So this is definitely an interesting concept that I've heard of, which is effectively sort of underpaying people for similar skills that they have in-house or in America in this case. I wouldn't be surprised for potentially larger firms like a Google or an Amazon or something like that at that scale and having tens of thousands of employees. Strategies like this would be true. I've generally worked at companies that have been smaller than that, and what I have observed is it is actually very hard to find very skilled individuals at very specific things. And so being able to open up the pool of candidates to include folks that have H-1B, I think is a net positive. And that's how I've generally seen it work myself, which is if you're looking for the most skilled individual, that person isn't guaranteed to be in America. But I do see that there's this also downside that exists having interacted with folks who have H-1B, which is if you're in this scenario, you're sort of trapped with your current employer. And if you don't get one, then maybe you have to go and move all of your stuff. Maybe you've been in America for a while, and that's not something that you really want to do. And so in many cases, these people are actually less likely to negotiate salaries either at time of offer or even while you're there, or negotiate raises, etc. And so I do think this does naturally deflate the market and the value of, or the cost of, those employees because they're in these tough situations. And I think that has more to do with the discrepancy in power between the employer and these employees. Again, this is a dynamic that we see a lot across even folks who don't have H-1B visas, which is as employers get more power over employees, basically whether or not the job market is tight, for example, they might say, well, there's more people who are looking for jobs right now. Therefore, if somebody leaves due to being unhappy, I will more easily be able to replace them. And so therefore, I could gamble a little bit more and, pay them a little bit less, maybe not give them as good of benefits, maybe pull back salary, pull back bonus, whatever that scenario is. And people might just take that when the market isn't good. But when it is great, then that's when people start to move and employers start to pay out more and potentially even give more benefits. And so this power dynamic is seen even with folks who don't have H-1B. And I think this is another case that maybe they'll talk about here, which is I feel like H-1B employees are employees that are uniquely more disadvantaged than the standard employee. So if there's a tight job market and you're an American citizen and you have a green card or whatever it is, and you're working for an employer who isn't necessarily being fair, you have more options available to you than if you have an H-1B. And so this means inherently the H-1B employees are going to sort of be taken advantage of in a scenario where they aren't protected. And the way that the H-1B works is that you're sort of tied to a particular employer, not that you can work anywhere. So if you're one of these skilled individuals who we found and maybe you're the best at this particular thing and you look for another job, you need another transfer of that H-1B or something else before you can actually work at another company. It's not just valid for anywhere in America. And this is one of those limitations. And I think that does lead to some unfair competition here. And again, I'm not going to say that no company exists that isn't taking advantage of this. I would have to assume somebody's taking advantage of any policy that exists at some point in time. But most of the cases that I've seen, I think they have been generally used somewhat fairly to try and find the best employees. But again, I think there's an inherent lack of protection for these type of employees that I think lead to them being less paid, and that can be seen in this way. So I'm not sure if I've actually seen data, and hopefully they'll cover why they stated it as this is sort of just a ploy for underpaying people and not necessarily a skill gap or skilled employee selection process.
So dependent upon that high skilled labor, whereas there's others in this country who feel like immigration, any kind of immigration essentially, is taking away American jobs.
There are constituencies of...
That's such a weird scenario in my mind. I think at face value, I understand the concern, which is in America, there's a finite amount of jobs at a particular point in time. And therefore, if somebody comes to America to take that job, there is one less job that exists for everybody else who's already here. So I understand fundamentally how that would be true. But again, for myself being in a STEM field, mostly seeing STEM workers where H-1Bs are pretty prevalent, I don't really see that as being the case. Usually there's not like a line down the block of people who are just overqualified for tech jobs that are just begging to work, and that you're choosing to hire someone for an H-1B. At least I haven't encountered that myself. Usually what I do see is that because they have more choices, some of these people could be potentially less skilled than the H-1B counterparts, or maybe they have different standards, etc., that exist. And so maybe they're not the right fit for you. Maybe they don't have the particular specialization. And so for whatever reason, you might not have a particular match with that individual, but it's still very rare. And in most of the cases that I see, regardless of status, I believe that usually you're checking probably dozens or maybe even hundreds of candidates to find the perfect person for these roles. Because again, at these salary bands, for the most part, tech employees, I would assume, generally make probably 100K-ish or more, sometimes even multiple hundreds of K if you're talking about like a Google, for instance. And so paying an H-1B employee like 200K versus an American employee like 210 or 220K isn't really that advantageous to you as a company compared to just hiring the better employee, because that better employee is likely going to be better than 5 or 10% better than the employee who isn't as good. And so while those techniques could exist again, for me, as a person who is an employee and also hires people, the way this works is that employment exists because your employer believes that you will earn them more money than they have to pay you for your salary. That's the entire reason why it exists. They're not doing some type of charity. Maybe you work for like your parents or a friend, and maybe it is in your particular case. But for most people, the reason why they work is because somebody believes that they can have a person in a particular role, and that person will earn more than what it costs them for that employee. And when that isn't true, they will either pay that person less or replace them with somebody cheaper or get rid of that job entirely. And so because you're talking about a larger margin, and for somebody at Google or Apple or Amazon, likely these employees on average are probably earning the company $500,000, $1 million or more in some cases, and you're paying them still a very large amount, like 200K, let's say. This example, especially if you're in like California, they get paid quite well. Trying to save 20K on somebody who could make or break the difference between you make $1 million or 1.1 million doesn't make any sense really in the grand scheme of things. And so I'm, again, fairly skeptical of that being the pure driving force for some of these situations.
American workers who are pointing out, I think quite rightly, that there is a massive displacement of American tech workers by younger, cheaper, foreign workers every single year. And that does not allow the labor market to act the way it should by encouraging people to go into these STEM fields.
So what impact does the H-1B visa program have on the nation's workforce? And can the U.S. thrive without foreign workers? In 2024, the tech industry saw more than 150,000 workers from almost 550 companies laid off. As of March this year, around 23,000 people from 81 different tech companies have also been retrenched.
Yeah, this could be a big factor. I haven't really heard this argument before the last few years where tech workers have been hit pretty hard post-COVID. And again, this is where trying to wrap my mind around people who are trying to legitimately make this argument, I think it is fair that people would be looking for cheaper labor, like younger workers in general, in certain scenarios. This could also be a type of survivor bias where if you're hiring someone with an H-1B, that person has to be pretty good. There are regulations in place to show that you looked for employees in America and that you couldn't find somebody who was valid, not necessarily meaning that they don't exist, but if you're looking in New York and somebody who's perfect for your role is in California, but they're not willing to move or they're not looking in your area, then you need somebody to fill that job. And so somebody overseas might be interested in taking that job, or somebody who's already in America just working for another company with an H-1B, for instance. And so that person might want to take that spot. And so if they're not that good, it's going to be really hard to prove that you really needed that person to sponsor them for an H-1B. And so likely the employees who are H-1B visa holders, I would assume, are already very good engineers or tech workers. I would have to assume by default they are above average. Certainly, we're not hiring the lowest performing people abroad to replace American workers, again, because they would earn us so much more money in that case. And so it doesn't make sense to me on like a purely capitalistic standpoint of assuming the employer wants to make as much money out of these workers as possible. Trying to undercut their salary by 5, 10, maybe even 20% isn't going to outweigh somebody who's really skilled being able to earn them many times over that amount that you're spending on them. And so this could be a survivor bias thing where they're seeing H-1B employees sticking around at these companies after some of these layoffs. And this could just be they are very skilled workers, and that's how they got an H-1B to begin with. And so therefore, if you're looking to lay someone off, you're likely going to try to keep your most skilled workers regardless of their H-1B status or not. And as a manager myself, you don't really know in all cases. Like, America is built on immigrants, and so it's not like they walk around with like their visa on like their shoulder or something like that. Like, they're just normal human beings that you interact with, and you don't know whether this person is an immigrant or an American citizen or something else. And so for the most part, I don't think it comes into play for most people, would be my guess. And so likely these are just some type of survivor bias where potentially below average US workers are getting laid off and seeing their H-1B peers stick around and maybe assuming that there's some type of nefarious bias going on here. But I think people should also be asking themselves, are they really as good as that individual on average or at that particular thing that that person is doing? And obviously there's going to be mistakes made, or maybe you're on a particular product that isn't as good. But again, I'm finding this very hard to imagine myself, just because, again, your employer is very greedy. They want the best skill to make the most money. And unless your skill is very moderately improved over somebody else, they're not going to want to optimize for cost cutting in that case. It's much better to have one very skilled worker than two mediocre workers who make less. And I think that's true likely at most skilled jobs.
But despite those losses, tech companies are still eager to hire foreign workers.
A lot of household names like Cisco and Google and Amazon and Apple and so on that bring people in. And what's interesting is what you would expect to find is that if the market got bad and all of a sudden they had to let people go, that they would stop trying to recruit overseas, right? Because the whole idea here is that they can't find people in the United States. But it's interesting that you don't see that connection.
Elon Musk, in a December 2024 post to X,
I think that was an interesting argument that they just made that they very quickly went over, which is basically these people are laying off employees, but then they're still also hiring a good chunk of H-1B candidates. So again, presumably layoffs, you are laying off the people who are not as good as others. So again, I could see an argument made for them already knowing these employees aren't good, and that's why they chose to lay them off. And so they're taking a chance on somebody else that they haven't worked with before. I would hope if they already knew that they laid somebody off who was actually good, that they would go back to those employees. So I think this is a good argument that's being made. I think something that they aren't showing here that would have been very useful information is they are just showing the number of H-1B approval petitions. But again, as they highlighted in a previous example, most H-1B petitions are for renewals, not necessarily for brand new ones. And so the two things that I wish they had shown here was whether these are brand new H-1B petitions versus refreshing for employees who made it through the layoffs, and also how many people they hired during these spans. Because again, they're just highlighting the H-1B compared to layoffs. And so it's unclear, is H-1B like 80% of the employees that they hired back at these cases, or did they hire back just as many people as they laid off, and H-1B just happened to be a fraction of that total, but it's really being highlighted here. So this is interesting information. I feel like they have a nugget of a argument here that I could certainly believe, but I don't feel like they've represented enough information for me to believe it quite yet. But maybe they'll add to this soon.
that connection.
Elon Musk, in a December 2024 post to X, said he preferred to hire Americans, but there is a dire shortage of extremely talented and motivated engineers in America.
Yeah, so I think also another good point that isn't being covered here is the H-1B process and other visa processes cost money. And you also have to pay lawyers and other folks to manage that process. It is noticeably easier to hire an American. So again, this is where it's sort of, I'm struggling to wrap my mind around this because it is by far and away easier and likely cheaper to just hire an American worker for more money because you have to pay extra on top of the person's salary for an H-1B candidate. Plus, you likely need to pay internal folks and maybe even external counsel to cover the entire legal process behind this. Whereas you could just pay an American worker like an extra $10,000 a year or something like that and just skip all of that entirely. It'll be faster. It's usually longer to get somebody on H-1B. So I think for an American worker, usually you can get them in started within like a week or two. And most H-1B candidates, I think usually takes about a month and a half to get them hired. So you would basically pay less money to hire an American worker. They would start sooner. So again, by most factors, it is just better to do so. And that's why some of these other processes exist, is to deter people from doing exactly what people fear, which is like trying to undercut American workers, where again, there's enough incentives in my mind to just hire American workers if they are so qualified. I think one of the hardest things is if you're American, you're also likely not as interested in relocating. I feel like that's something that is much rarer nowadays, especially post-COVID and the remote working environment that we had. I feel like pre-COVID, everyone was just used to going into office all the time. And so you just knew you had to move to get a different type of job. But I feel like this is far less common. I haven't spoken with anybody who's actually relocated for some of my work or folks similar to it who are American citizens who chose to relocate just for a job opportunity across the country. Whereas somebody on H-1B likely doesn't have a home, maybe doesn't have a family set up yet. And that's also true for younger employees. They might be more willing to move and relocate for some of these jobs and enter the market where the jobs that can support their employment actually exist.
America. Foreign-born workers, including green card holders and those on temporary work visas, made up almost a quarter of all STEM workers in the U.S. in 2019.
This is a good stat. I'm guessing they're going to reference a newer stat soon. So 23.1% is foreign-born workers in STEM fields in 2019 here.
Up from 16% in 2000.
Okay. Up from 16% in 2000. That's good to know. So I was expecting them to show a different number that was more recent, but it does make sense that this number would increase over time. I'm not entirely sure what the difference was between 2000 and 2019. They possibly adjusted some of the policies around this visa and how easy it is to get them. But again, curious how they're going to elaborate on this point. And again, they mentioned all these layoffs, which mostly happened post-COVID. So it's odd, again, that they're sort of building this case, but then having varying data to support it. So that number that they just showed of like how much of an increase it was for H-1B workers from 2000 to 2019 would have been far more effective if they showed like 2019 to like 2021, for instance, where they also previously referenced the layoffs. So again, I think we're getting glimpses of things here, and I'm hopefully attempting to be open-minded here and be convinced, but I feel like we're like almost getting the data, or we're almost getting the timelines that would potentially be convincing to me. And then we sort of move on to another random stat. And so I feel like we have an incomplete argument here from what they sort of highlighted originally.
Fiscal year 2025 alone, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, received 470,000 H-1B registrations, down from the previous year, but roughly in line with 2023. Proponents of the program say recruiting foreign-born workers spurs innovation and creates U.S. jobs, and the strong demand requires a lottery to determine which petitions are processed. The process seemingly protects American workers, but loopholes do exist.
There are absolutely loopholes that allow employers to get around hiring American workers or attempting to hire American workers before they petition for an H-1B worker.
Opponents argue the program is rife with abuse and a source of cheap labor detrimental to U.S. workers.
For the tech companies, it's simply a matter of business. If you give any company the opportunity to hire a worker for $10 as opposed to $20, what possible motivation is there for them?
So again, they just sort of use the straw person example, which is, again, where this isn't the case. Nobody is hiring the same employee for H-1B at half of the cost of an American worker. That's certainly not the case. There's enough regulation to prevent unfair pay for American citizens and workers in America that prevents anybody basically with the same title from getting paid half as much as another person of the same title. These regulations exist to prevent abuse from occurring. And so again, they're sort of using this straw person example of why not pay somebody half when you could pay somebody else the same thing. And again, STEM workers, in my mind, are different. If you're talking about like a laborer or something like that, I'm all with you. I'm in on this argument. Why would you need an H-1B employee to drive a truck and transport goods? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. Americans are all over the place that can drive and move things over. That scenario I could see trying to undercut in that scenario. But for STEM jobs in these highly scientific areas where usually there's a lot of education required, a lot of experience, and a lot of niche work that exists, you're usually looking for the best employee. And I think if the possibility was to pay somebody half as much and they get the same work, then I think that argument in itself stands on its own, which is if you're a STEM worker and somebody who is younger than you has less experience and is willing to do get paid half as much as you are, but they can perform just as well as you, then that isn't a you versus STEM H-1B employee. That is American worker who just isn't that good compared to another employee that happens to be good, in my mind. So again, I think this is an invalid argument that is used, but I would believe this argument if it was for non-STEM fields. Like if you need retail workers, if you need transportation people, if you need laborers, things that are not particularly heavy in education or specialization, and it's more of a generic skill that can be leveraged from the standard citizen base in America. Yeah, I'm probably with you here. I don't know why we would hire anyone else externally unless you're trying to undercut the market. But for something where skill, education, experience, not all humans are made exactly the same, and somebody who could be very skilled at one thing might not be the thing that employer needs. And so somebody else who maybe is even less skilled than you, but is in a particular niche, might be better at that situation. And I think that becomes more and more prevalent in STEM fields.
To hire the more expensive worker. Companies are not people. They're not moral. They don't have ethics.
Calls have been made to reform the program.
Agreed. And so I think he had a core reasonable argument. I just disagree with it for this segment. I made the exact same argument for the pro H-1B worker scenario, which is I agree with some of the core of that argument other than the straw person that he started with of the paying somebody half as much for the same level of work. And so employers are greedy individuals, and so they're going to hire and do what they can for the best. And again, this is where STEM workers usually make multiples of what they earn. And so I think even back in the day, pre-COVID, so post-inflation and things like that, this is probably a much higher number. I think I heard statistics of, on average, due to the amount of revenue like Apple made, every employee was effectively on average making $1 million for the company. And I can guarantee you the average employee at Apple was not making $1 million. And so in most cases, the average employee is probably making, like I said, it's still a high number for most careers and for most salary bases, but I would guess probably like in the 200, maybe 250 range at best. And so they're probably earning 3, 4, 5 times their salary in these fields just because how well they scale. And so it doesn't make any sense to try to undercut somebody who can earn 5x their salary to save yourself 10K. I think if you could save 100K, like that individual made as that straw person example, maybe that would be enticing. But again, that assumes same quality for the two individuals. And again, that would be a problem inherently there in my mind. And so in that scenario in itself, like, let's maybe go back to it one more time of, let's say that they are equally skilled individuals. Being allowed to go to H-1B allows the pay to kind of shrink there. Is an interesting case, but wouldn't there be another American who would have taken 90% of the value, something along those lines? And so in that scenario, hopefully there's enough regulation to ensure that that American is looking for that job. And so I don't think you necessarily need to go overseas to get paid half or a noticeable decrease. There are American citizens who are coming out of school that are young that I would gladly take a lower salary than somebody who has 10, 20, 30 years of experience in a STEM field. And so there isn't even a need to go through all that hassle. And again, because of regulation around salaries, I don't think you can ever go to half of a salary for the same role. Maybe in certain states that might be true if they have certain exceptions, but I don't think that is technically legal, and you would have been in trouble for that regardless. And so even if you chose to pay somebody at the bottom of their pay band, it wouldn't be half. And so again, if you found an American who's willing to work at the bottom of that pay band, it would be simpler and easier for you. So maybe that's the argument, but I'm not sure if I agree with some of the data that they used or how they've accumulated that data to try to build a case here.
Program, including setting a wage floor for H-1B visa holders and abandoning the lottery system altogether.
If you made it 150,000, you probably would eliminate a lot of the displacement of American workers using H-1Bs, because what's often talked about is that this is a visa for the best and the brightest and, the genius. It is not that. There are, in a given pool of, 100 H-1Bs, there might be one or two who are truly outstanding. There'll be a third who are below average, a third that are average, and maybe a third that are slightly above average. But basically, this is just...
So I think this is an interesting case. So this one I could maybe get behind. So I think what he's arguing here is, how skilled does somebody need to be to become an H-1B employee? And I think that's a reasonable argument to make, which is where I don't agree with his kind of broad bell curve of there's only going to be a similar above average, below average, average attribution to an H-1B employee. I think that bell curve could be used across the entire population. And the way that I think about it is, if every human being on the planet was basically put on a bell curve for how good they would be for a particular job, yes, a person in a particular random country might not be the best person to employ, but hopefully that's not the case that we have here. And I'm not sure if they're actually giving any examples that disproves this. They are just sort of showing random statistics and then having people who use these straw person examples like that individual to kind of make these sort of invalid cases or arguments that are sort of inherently biased towards a particular end to make this case. But I think the core argument there I can get behind, which is, at what skill difference do we hire somebody from abroad? Because that could be something that is worth a debate, and saying, well, we wouldn't necessarily want somebody who is below average. I think I can totally agree with that. I think that is totally fair. Unless we've completely hired every possible employee in America who is below average, we shouldn't hire a below average person externally or have an immigrant come in to fill in that job. But again, this is where I don't think you can just put that global bell curve onto the current H-1B workers, because presumably you're already assessing those people. And again, as part of his previous argument, he mentioned how employers are greedy, and employers aren't just looking to hand out cash to really unskilled people, especially in the STEM field. And so that is a problem in that case. But I think an argument could be made of, well, should we only be hiring the top 10 percentile of workers for H-1B, and how do you assess that? I think that is a valid argument, because if you're going to compare an H-1B worker who is of average skill to another American worker of average skill, then a case could be there. And I think, again, this is where the skill levels have to be the same. But again, considering the fact that you have to pay for the H-1B process and hire people and pay for them to maintain this other stuff going on, there's an upfront cost at least. So presumably, even if you hire someone for H-1B, these are already limited to a certain amount of years. So I think most H-1B programs, I think it's 2 or 3 years, if I'm not mistaken, for the first visa that they get. And so you have an upfront cost that only can be used over a 2 or 3 year span. And so you inherently can just take all that money and then add it to an American individual's salary, and they can just have a advantage there. So I think there is an inherent bias towards the US citizen in this case. I think something that could be done here is, again, how do you even assess somebody being at like the top 10 percentile or the top 1 percentile in some of these scenarios would be very difficult, but you could likely just increase the price of this process for like an H-1B. And then again, that would just increase the incentive to hire an American worker when you're comparing apples to apples skill set wise.
Regular working stiffs with regular degrees from regular universities.
The median salary for a H-1B visa holder working in a computer-related job was $123,000 in 2022. The median salary of an H-1B visa holder working in education was $62,000 that year. The H-1B visa is typically granted for 3 years with the option to renew. There are a few exceptions to allow petitioners to file extensions beyond that time.
I've been in the country since March of 2001. I came here when I was about 19 years old from India to pursue higher education. I ultimately got my degree in economics. I had global sales operations for my company.
Gaurav Saxena is an Indian national, part of a large group of skilled foreign workers on H-1B visas. India dominates H-1B approvals with 72.
Does economics count as a STEM field? I'm not sure. I would have assumed no by default. And so I'm not entirely sure if this is a fair comparison. I'd say apologies for anybody in economics. I don't mean to belittle your degree. I just mean I'm not sure if it's particularly part of the STEM program. And so I'm not sure if they're starting to switch to a broader argument here, but I thought some of their focus was on tech and STEM workers, as that was a good portion of what they had focused on in the first half of this video. So apologies for anyone who has that degree. I just wasn't sure that was part of STEM. And so I feel like we're sort of like moving the goalposts on this argument as we speak. And again, they even had the sort of computer related salaries versus education ones. I don't know what the education ones are, but this is a different argument. Like I said, I think for a standard everyday degree that you could get, and there's a plethora of in America, like English or psychology or standard business degrees, we should just be hiring Americans for that. I think if there's a very sizable H-1B population there, then that could very well warrant abuse is possible. But we seem to be moving this goalpost of highlighting how STEM is leveraging so many H-1B programs, and then sort of highlighting these other examples of non-STEM work and employment.
2% of visas going to Indian-born workers in 2023.
I'm not sure if people in the US truly understand the level of headache that people who are on H1s have to go through. Small things which nobody else understands, right? For example, every 3 years, we say we need to get our H1 renewal. For that renewal, you have to pay renewal fees. You've got to hire a lawyer.
However, his goal, like many, is to be a permanent legal resident. Nearly half of Americans believe skilled foreign workers should be prioritized for legal immigration over other groups, a research survey found.
What immigrants?
That's a pretty large percentage. It's not super high, but I do agree. I think if we could get all, like, if we take a step back here and say, if they're the most skilled workers in a particular field anywhere in the world, and we as Americans can take those people from their current countries where they would be advancing those countries and advancing their technology, advancing their particular field, outpacing likely the value that they bring to their community and their country. And we can bring those people to America so they can benefit Americans and the American technology set, our education, whatever it is, whatever their specialty lies in. Wouldn't that be awesome? Like, imagine having a country with all the best people, like the smartest people, the most educated people who can help everybody. Like, those things are going to help others. And so, like the creation of the microwave or the telephone or things like that, these help everyday Americans and were invented from people who were scientists and folks who were very specialized in their career. And so wouldn't that be fantastic to have those people here helping build our economy, help build out advantages for us? And so to me, that sounds like a win. And I think, again, this is an argument that other individuals sort of made, but they sort of just kind of like cut to something else, which was, I think there's a distinction on how skilled are these people. And I think that's kind of where some of these arguments can be made, which is if we're getting average people or below average people for jobs that could have been done by American workers, I think I'm on board with that argument. But for skilled people, there's so few very, very truly skilled and driven people in the world, in my opinion. Like, think of Einstein, for instance. Like, he was an American. He wasn't born in America. And he came to America and helped out and shared his knowledge here. And are you saying you just don't want those people on some principle of somebody else happened to be born here, and so therefore that person takes precedent over somebody who is highly skilled or very smart and who happened to be born in another country? That one, I'm not on board with. Maybe each of you have your own opinion, and feel free to share in the comments, because again, this is only 42%, so this isn't even majority in this case. But in my opinion, I think having the best people come to America should hopefully create more jobs than what they're taking and create more opportunities for Americans than not. I think the case gets tough once you start talking about people with less skill, with less specialized degrees, less higher performing individuals. Those I could see the argument completely switching for. We don't need more people here who are not good. Why would you have that when you could have an American worker do it? If that person is of average intelligence and average skill, there's no reason to go out and get somebody else who can fill that same role.
They start out new businesses and they work hard.
The approval time frame is anything but timely. H-1B visa holders have a long and uphill battle if they want to gain citizenship. The immigration court process can become filled and delayed with deportation cases, asylum seekers, and the many other visa applications seeking approval. Buy American and Hire American was an executive order aimed at tightening immigration policies to protect American jobs signed by Trump during his previous administration. But he's recently had a pivot in his approach to foreign-born workers.
Trump has sort of fashioned himself in the past, as those comments this summer showed, of wanting to sort of expand this skilled immigration process, of fixing the legal immigration process in addition to stopping illegal immigration.
Trump recently unveiled a fast-track ticket for foreign nationals to gain citizenship, a golden visa with a whopping $5 million price tag. Trump claimed this could potentially be a way for companies with deep pockets to work around the H-1B visa process.
If you're Apple and you want...
Yeah, this is a good argument here for this case, which is if this is used for actually employing people, if some company thinks another human being that is not in America is worth so much to them, that they are so smart, they're so skilled, that they're willing to pay $5 million for the opportunity to pay that person a salary, that is insane. Like, that person has to be so good. There's very few Americans who anybody is paying $5 million to. So many Americans don't have $5 million. And so Imagine somebody choosing out of pocket to pay $5 million to then hand you more money afterwards. Like that is so high level of skill if this is how it's going to be used. But it should exist. If there is somebody that is that valuable, we should be doing that. Companies would want to do that, again, because they are greedy individuals. And I think the fact that this case exists and somebody's actually making this argument, in my mind, sort of validates my opinion that I mentioned earlier, which is you're going to want an employee who can make the most money for you. You aren't necessarily looking at the cheapest employee. And I think that's the key distinction here between skilled, specialized workers versus an average worker who's potentially less skilled or doing labor or manual labor type of work, which is, in that case, if anybody could do that job, the cheapest option wins. But in a scenario where that person has direct impact on how much money you can make and how fast you can go and how well you can beat your competition, to you, money is less of an option. You're trying to get the best that actually exists. It matters less whether you're American born or not. Usually you're just looking for the best possible person you can gain access to at that particular time to get the job done that you need.
A great executive that's in Taiwan or that's in China, you really can't get them. It's almost impossible. So this is a way to say, okay, you can't get it under the legal, logical program because those programs are so dysfunctional. So just pay the 5 or 10 million.
I get calls from...
He just described it as dysfunctional, so maybe he means that there's just no rhyme or reason to it. But again, I think if they believe this case exists and that those people still aren't able to make it through the H-1B process, I think that also highlights how challenging it is to get an H-1B visa. It's not easy. It's not like everybody's just, you apply and then boom, you get it. There's still the likelihood of you not getting it, you not proving that you did enough due diligence to find an American worker, or that that individual isn't particularly skilled enough to warrant gaining an H-1B visa. And so the fact that people believe there are incredibly hyper skilled employees that exist out in the world that we can't get through the H-1B process, and they're willing to pay and put down $5 million just for the opportunity to hire them, again, is insane to me. And I would, we should totally hire those people. We should do that. Employers would do that if they think they can make that money back.
As an example, companies where they want to hire the number one student at a school. A person comes from India, China, Japan. I want to be able to have that person stay in the country. These companies can go and buy a gold card, and they can use it as a matter of recruitment. At the same time, the company is using that money to pay down debt.
From 2023 to 2033, the U.S. will see an estimated 356,700 computer and information technology jobs opening annually. By 2026, America will have a shortage of 1.2 million engineers.
Wow. Again, that was a really interesting stat that they just showed, which is by 2026, that's not that far off, we're going to have a shortage of 1.2 million engineers. And again, I'm not really sure how they're building this argument. I feel like maybe I'm just falling victim to maybe some rage bait that's going on right now of they're sort of making these half-hearted arguments. And now in the 11th hour, they're saying well, we do hire quite a few H-1B, but we're off by over 1 million people in this category. So what does that mean? We just aren't going to hire anybody? We're just going to have those jobs empty because we would prefer to not hire somebody on an H-1B visa? I'm a little confused as how they came to this as one of their final points in this video, is that actually there is a shortage. We probably aren't just willfully not hiring American engineers. There just aren't enough. And so I'm just blown away by how they sort of led through this video, sharing stats of not even overlapping time periods, discussing pre-COVID versus post-COVID in various arguments, STEM versus non-STEM, straw person examples being used throughout, and then boom, at the end, they're sort of saying, actually, there's a shortage. We need way more engineers than we actually have. It's blowing my mind.
The American dream is absolutely attainable. If you're willing to work hard, if you're willing to, put in the effort, you will attain it in your own way.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.